England, 1851. A woman of 34 years has only two paths before her: marriage or the slow disappearance that society grants to those who have failed at it. The morning room of Whitmore House held the peculiar silence of a dwelling where affection had withered into obligation. Eleanor sat at the writing desk, her pale fingers moving across columns of figures that seemed to mock her with their relentless arithmetic. 10 years she had been doing this, reconciling accounts that would not reconcile, stretching resources that had grown impossibly thin, maintaining appearances for a family that scarcely noticed her efforts. The autumn light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows that deepened the worn spots on the carpet beneath her feet. Her father, the Viscount, had lost fortunes in colonial ventures that existed primarily in his imagination. The actual money had disappeared into accounts managed by men who smiled too widely and promised returns that never materialized. Eleanor had inherited her mother's practical mind, but her father's tendency toward self-deception, though she fought the latter tendency with every calculation she entered into these leather-bound ledgers. The door opened without warning, as it always did when the Viscountess entered a room. Eleanor's mother swept into the morning room with the authority of a woman who had never questioned her right to occupy space, her emerald visiting dress rustling with each calculated step. At 52, the Viscountess retained the sharp features that had once commanded admiration, though the years had sharpened them into something more austere than handsome. "Eleanor, your posture," the Viscountess observed without preamble. "Hunched over those tedious documents as though you were a clerk in some merchant's office. It is no wonder the gentlemen show you so little attention." Eleanor straightened her spine, a gesture she had performed so many times that it had become automatic as breathing. "Good morning, Mother. I was reviewing the household accounts." "Yes, well, there are more important matters to attend to." The Viscountess settled herself into the chair opposite Eleanor's desk, arranging her skirts with meticulous care. "Charlotte has received another invitation to Lady Ashford's autumn soirée, the third this season, and Rebecca's betrothal will be announced within the month, the Baronet of Henwick Park. Your father is most pleased." Eleanor had heard about Rebecca's engagement 3 days prior, whispered between servants in the corridors where gossip traveled faster than any official announcement. Her sister, at 26, had secured a baronet of moderate fortune and considerably advanced years. The arrangement was considered a triumph in their circle, though Eleanor understood that the baronet needed an infusion of capital more than he needed a bride. "I am pleased for Rebecca," Eleanor said carefully. "She appears content with the arrangement." The Viscountess waved a hand with dismissal. "Content is hardly the word. She is sensible, which is far superior to contentment. A woman in her position cannot afford the luxury of emotion." The Viscountess paused, her gaze traveling over Eleanor in a manner that felt distinctly like assessment. "Unlike yourself, Eleanor, you have reached an age where sensibility becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Your situation requires more immediate attention." The words, though not unexpected, struck with their usual precision. Eleanor was 34. In the eyes of society, she had already transgressed the boundaries of acceptable spinsterhood. She had been presented at 17, had received callers in the years that followed, but something, her quietness perhaps, or her tendency to reveal thoughtfulness rather than empty charm, had prevented offers from materializing until now. "I am aware of my age, Mother," Eleanor replied, returning her attention to the ledger before her, though the numbers blurred together in her vision. "Clearly, awareness has done little to improve your circumstances," the Viscountess said. "However, Providence has decided to intervene. Mr. Edmund Harrington has expressed an interest in making your acquaintance. His proposal has been deemed suitable." Eleanor's pen stilled against the paper. Edmund Harrington was 40 years old, a widower of moderate fortune, whose late wife had apparently been as forgettable as she was forgotten. Eleanor had seen him at various social functions, a man of adequate appearance, with graying hair and the manner of someone who had learned to conduct himself acceptably, without ever inspiring genuine warmth. He had always struck her as a man conducting his life according to a predetermined schedule rather than genuine feeling. "He has made a proposal already?" Eleanor asked, though she meant to inquire about the nature of his intentions. "Not formally, naturally," the Viscountess explained. "Your father has been managing the discussions. Harrington's financial situation is entirely respectable, and his estates in Sussex are well maintained. He has indicated that he is seeking a wife of mature judgment, someone who understands the practical realities of matrimony, rather than entertaining foolish romantic notions. The Viscountess leaned forward slightly. He specifically requested you, Eleanor. He has observed you at several functions and believes you possess the qualities he requires. Eleanor felt something contract within her chest. Not excitement, but rather a strange resignation. At 34, with no fortune of her own and a family drowning in debts that grew more urgent each season, this was precisely the sort of offer that women in her position received. This was, in fact, more than she had any right to expect. "When am I to meet with him formally?" Eleanor asked. "Tomorrow afternoon," the Viscountess replied. "He will call at 4 o'clock. You will wear the blue silk dress, the one that suits your coloring. And Eleanor, do try to appear pleasant. Your tendency toward somber reflection is not attractive in a potential bride." After her mother departed, Eleanor returned to her ledgers, though her concentration had fractured entirely. She found herself instead thinking about her childhood, when she had harbored vague notions of marrying for affection, for something more substantial than mutual agreement regarding household management and financial necessity. That girl seemed impossibly naive now, almost embarrassing in her optimism. Eleanor rose from her desk and walked to the window, gazing out at the small garden that had once belonged to her grandmother. It lay largely neglected now, the rose bushes overgrown, the paths obscured by creeping weeds. She wondered if this marriage would be similar. A space that had once held beauty gradually allowed to decay through inattention. Yet what alternative did she possess? Her family needed the financial stability that Edmund Harrington represented. Her father's creditors grew more aggressive each month. Rebecca's marriage, while advantageous, would not resolve the fundamental crisis of the Whitmore family's circumstances. The afternoon brought the customary social visits that occupied the drawing room. Charlotte appeared in an afternoon dress of pale yellow, her dark hair arranged in fashionable curls that required hours of careful attention from her lady's maid. At 24, Charlotte possessed the kind of beauty that society valued. Delicate features, an air of innocence, a tendency to laugh at gentlemen's remarks as though they had said something genuinely amusing rather than merely predictable. She was engaged in conversation with Lady Pembroke when Eleanor entered, discussing the likelihood of Lord Ashford's unmarried son making an appearance at the upcoming assemblies. Eleanor settled into her chair near the fireplace, aware that she was expected to be present, but not to dominate the conversation. This was the role that had become familiar to her, the older sister who managed the household, who appeared at social functions but never demanded attention, who could be relied upon to fade into the background when more interesting company was present. "Eleanor," Lady Pembroke called out, as if suddenly remembering her presence. "Have you heard the speculation regarding the Duke of Northwick? It is said he has not entertained for nearly 7 years, not since his wife's death. One wonders what keeps a man of his station so completely removed from society." "I had not heard specific details," Eleanor replied carefully. "The woman he married was considered quite beneath his station," Lady Pembroke continued, apparently satisfied to provide the information herself. "Some say he has never recovered from his grief. Others suggest darker motives. Perhaps he harbors secrets that require his isolation." She paused dramatically. "He is 36 now and remains one of the most eligible bachelors in England, should he ever choose to marry again. Yet he shows no inclination toward society whatsoever." Charlotte leaned forward with interest. "Is he truly so terrible in appearance? Perhaps that explains his seclusion." "On the contrary," Lady Pembroke replied. "From all accounts he is quite striking in his way. Dark hair, intense eyes, that remote manner that some women find compelling. But he has built walls around himself that few have managed to breach. It is said his own mother can barely persuade him to attend her events." Eleanor found herself contemplating the Duke of Northwick, a man she had glimpsed only once or twice at crowded assemblies, standing always at the periphery, speaking to no one unless necessity demanded it. She wondered what isolation felt like when one possessed his power and wealth. She imagined it must feel entirely different than the invisibility she inhabited, which was enforced by circumstance rather than chosen for oneself. As evening descended and the visitors departed, Eleanor climbed the stairs to her chamber. Tomorrow Edmund Harrington would call, and she would smile politely and listen to whatever he wished to discuss. In a few weeks' time, assuming all proceeded conventionally, she would become his wife. She would manage his household as competently as she managed this one, would bear his children if he desired them, would support his position in society, as was expected of a woman in her new status. This was the life that awaited her, not the life she might have chosen, but the life that was available to her now, and compared to the alternative, it seemed almost generous. The cathedral bells ceased their ringing at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and Eleanor felt the weight of that silence more acutely than she had ever felt anything. She stood before the altar in her white silk gown, an indulgence her father had insisted upon, claiming that his eldest daughter deserved at least one beautiful thing on her wedding day, and waited. The early autumn light filtered through the stained glass windows above, casting jeweled patterns across the stone floor. Hundreds of guests occupied the pews behind her, their presence a combined force of expectation and barely concealed speculation. Eleanor's gloved fingers trembled slightly as she held her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. Her lady's maid had spent 3 hours arranging her hair, weaving it with pearl pins and securing the delicate lace veil that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. She looked precisely as a bride should look, composed, elegant, untouched by doubt. Yet beneath the carefully constructed exterior, her heart moved with an erratic tempo that suggested she might shatter at any moment. The Reverend consulted his pocket watch with visible discomfort. A murmur rippled through the assembled guests, not yet alarmed, but decidedly puzzled. Edmund Harrington should have appeared 20 minutes prior. The ceremony was scheduled to commence at 1:30. It was now nearly 2. Eleanor's mother sat in the front pew, her face a study in controlled distress. The Viscountess had spent the morning ensuring that every detail of the wedding breakfast was precisely arranged, that the flowers adorning the church reflected appropriately elegant taste, that Eleanor's appearance would create no embarrassment to the family name. Now she watched her daughter standing abandoned at the altar with an expression that suggested Eleanor had somehow orchestrated this humiliation personally. Another 15 minutes passed. A footman appeared at the rear of the cathedral, walking with evident urgency toward the Reverend. They conferred quietly, though the acoustics of the church meant that portions of their conversation drifted forward to those seated nearest the altar. Eleanor caught fragments. Message only just arrived. Most regrettable. Circumstances beyond control. The Reverend turned to Eleanor, his face betraying discomfort that no amount of ecclesiastical training could quite suppress. Miss Eleanor, I have received word from Mr. Harrington. He finds himself unable to proceed with the ceremony. He has sent his deepest apologies, but indicates that unforeseen circumstances have rendered his immediate presence impossible. The world did not end. This was Eleanor's first coherent thought as she stood motionless, absorbing the words. The world did not end. It merely fractured into 1,000 pieces, each one reflecting her humiliation back to her with crystalline clarity. She became aware of every sound simultaneously, the collective gasp from the guests, the sharp intake of breath from her mother, the scrape of chairs as people began to move with the restless energy of those witnessing social catastrophe. There must be some misunderstanding, Eleanor heard herself say, her voice emerging steadier than seemed possible. Perhaps he has been delayed. Surely. The message is quite explicit, Miss Eleanor. The Reverend interrupted gently. Mr. Harrington expresses his sincere regrets but cannot in good conscience proceed. He offers no further explanation, only his apologies. Eleanor became aware that she was still holding her bouquet, that the roses seemed impossibly white, impossibly perfect, impossibly cruel in their beauty. She became aware that she was breathing, that people were turning to stare at her, that her name was being whispered with the sort of fascination usually reserved for scandal. She became aware that she was 34 years old and standing alone at an altar before hundreds of witnesses who had come to watch her transform into a bride, and instead would leave having witnessed her transformation into society's newest object of pity and speculation. Her mother rose from the pew with the abruptness of someone who could no longer maintain composure. The Viscountess's face had shifted from distress to something more dangerous, a mixture of fury and embarrassment that appeared to threaten to overwhelm her entirely. This is intolerable, Eleanor heard her mother say, though the words seemed to come from a great distance. Eleanor, you must come with me. We cannot remain here any longer. The walk from the cathedral felt eternal and instantaneous simultaneously. Eleanor moved through the church as though navigating a dream, aware of eyes following her, aware of whispered conversations commencing the moment she passed, aware that her life had altered in some fundamental way that could not be undone or minimized. She caught glimpses of familiar faces, acquaintances who had attended her presentation as a debutante, who had danced with her at assemblies, who had exchanged pleasantries at drawing-room visits. Now they looked at her as though she had become an entirely different person, someone worthy of pity or judgment or morbid fascination. The carriage ride to Whitmore House passed in near silence, broken only by her mother's rapid breathing and occasional expressions of incoherent outrage. The Viscountess did not ask Eleanor what she was feeling. The Viscountess did not inquire whether Eleanor had any knowledge of Harrington's intentions. The Viscountess merely expressed, at considerable length, how thoroughly Eleanor had managed to humiliate the family through her apparent failure to secure and maintain a suitor's commitment. "I cannot comprehend how you have managed to bungle this so entirely," the Viscountess said, her voice sharp as glass. "A man of Mr. Harrington's station does not simply abandon a wedding without cause, Eleanor. What did you do? What did you say to him that would provoke such an action?" "I did nothing, Mother," Eleanor replied, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. "I have scarce been alone with him since our engagement was arranged." "Well, something must explain his behavior," the Viscountess insisted. "You must have done something. The man was entirely agreeable until the wedding itself. What possible circumstance could have intervened in the final hours?" Eleanor did not answer. She had no answer to give. She pressed her face against the carriage window and watched London pass by, each familiar street now rendered foreign by the weight of her disgrace. Over the following days, the truth emerged in fragments delivered through servants' gossip and veiled hints in society correspondence. Mr. Edmund Harrington was in financial difficulty, far exceeding what the family had understood. He had debts to financiers of questionable reputation, men who operated outside the bounds of genteel society, men who did not respond kindly to unpaid obligations. Furthermore, there were suggestions, never quite stated directly, but conveyed through meaningful pauses and significant glances, that his sudden departure from London was related to these obligations. He had apparently fled to the continent, leaving no forwarding address, abandoning not merely his bride, but also several business associates who had been expecting payment. More disturbing still were the whispers regarding Eleanor herself. Some claimed that Harrington had discovered some previously unknown scandal attached to Eleanor or her family. Others suggested more sinister explanations. But most disturbing was the gradual realization that Eleanor's name had been attached to various financial documents related to Harrington's business affairs, documents that Eleanor herself had never signed, never authorized, never even seen. By the end of the week, Eleanor received a letter from her Aunt Margot, the Viscountess's widowed sister, who lived on a modest property in the countryside. The letter was brief but resolute. Margot offered Eleanor refuge, distant from the immediate scrutiny of London society. Eleanor accepted without hesitation or discussion. Within 10 days of her wedding day, she departed from Whitmore House in a traveling carriage, leaving behind only a note indicating that she would be staying with her aunt for an indeterminate period. She did not say goodbye to her mother. She did not say goodbye to her sisters, who were now occupied with damage control regarding their own social positions. She did not acknowledge the whispers that followed her departure, the speculation about what might have occurred behind closed doors, the theories regarding her complicity in Harrington's apparent fraud. She simply removed herself from London and from the relentless gaze of a society that had transformed her from an invisible spinster into the most visible symbol of humiliation. The property that belonged to Margot stood situated some 30 miles from London, nestled into the rolling hills of Surrey, where autumn arrived earlier than it did in the city. The house itself was modest by comparison to the grand estates Eleanor had known, yet it possessed a quality that Whitmore House had long since lost: a sense of being lived in by someone who actually inhabited the space rather than merely occupied it. The gardens showed evidence of deliberate cultivation. The library was organized according to a system that Eleanor gradually came to understand, and the servants moved through their duties with the competence of people who had been trained to think rather than merely to obey. Margot was 59 years old, a widow for the past 22 years, having lost her husband to illness when she was scarcely older than Eleanor was now. She had elected not to remarry, a choice that Eleanor's mother regarded as evidence of either eccentricity or deficiency. Margot, however, seemed to view her unmarried state as an extraordinary gift, a freedom that married women relinquished the moment they spoke their vows. She worked the estate herself, collaborated with her steward on agricultural matters, maintained an extensive correspondence with various learned individuals regarding subjects that Eleanor's mother would have deemed entirely inappropriate for female contemplation. During the first weeks of Eleanor's residence, Margot did not speak directly about the circumstances that had driven Eleanor from London. Instead, she assigned her tasks. Eleanor was asked to inventory the library, an undertaking that required her to engage with texts she had never been permitted to examine during her years at Whitmore House. Philosophy, political economy, advanced mathematics, subjects deemed unsuitable for female minds were suddenly placed within her reach. Eleanor found herself absorbed in material that seemed to illuminate aspects of the world she had previously accepted as simple fact. "Your mother would consider this dangerous," Margot observed one afternoon, finding Eleanor surrounded by open volumes in the library. "The notion that a woman might comprehend economic principles without her capacity for domestic management being compromised. My mother considers many things dangerous that appear to be merely interesting," Eleanor replied, not looking up from her reading. "Indeed," Margot said. "Your mother has always been afraid of anything that might suggest a woman possesses resources beyond her beauty or her marriageability. It makes her anxious, I think, the thought that a woman might not require masculine validation to know her own worth." Beyond the library, Eleanor found herself gradually assuming greater responsibility for the property's management. Margot taught her to examine estate accounts, to understand the calculations that determined whether a property was prospering or declining, to review contracts with the tenants who worked the surrounding fields. One drizzling morning, ledger books spread across the oak table. Eleanor traced the rents of 3 tenant farms and discovered a pattern of missed payments that matched a blight reported in the steward's notes. Instead of ordering penalties, as her mother might have done, she drafted a remission schedule and proposed a cooperative seed purchase for spring barley. It was the first decision she made that changed another person's life for the better, and the first time the steward looked at her not as the Viscount's daughter, but as a mind worth consulting. This knowledge came as a revelation. The skills Eleanor had been practicing secretly for 10 years, the accounting, the resource allocation, the careful management of constrained circumstances, were not, after all, merely the province of male stewards and businessmen. They were legitimate intellectual pursuits. Letters arrived with irregular frequency from Whitmore House. Her father wrote 3 times during the first 2 months, each letter becoming progressively more urgent. The creditors were growing impatient. Legal proceedings had commenced regarding certain properties that might be seized. He had attempted to secure a new investment opportunity, but the capital required was beyond what he could currently access. His letters conveyed a desperation that Eleanor recognized as the signature of a man watching his entire world collapse gradually, powerlessly, aware of the disaster approaching but unable to forestall it. Her mother's correspondence was considerably briefer. The Viscountess wrote once, a letter that managed to convey both fury and blame without ever explicitly articulating either sentiment. She mentioned Rebecca's betrothal to the Baronet of Henwick with a tone suggesting that Eleanor's disgrace had somehow made this match more difficult to arrange, as though Eleanor's failure had contaminated the Whitmore name so thoroughly that each subsequent daughter required additional compensation to attract a suitor. She mentioned Charlotte's courtship with a considerably more pleased tone, noting that a certain earl had been most attentive to the girl. Rebecca's own letter arrived in October, filled with the excited concerns of a young woman focused entirely on matters of immediate household consequence. The baronet's estate required considerable renovation. Rebecca was occupied with decisions regarding furnishings and staffing. She made no reference to Eleanor's situation beyond a single sentence. "Mother says you are residing with Aunt Margot, and that it is best you remain there for the present." By the 5th month of Eleanor's residence with Margot, a transformation had commenced that Eleanor recognized but could not entirely articulate. Her hands had grown stronger from work. Her skin, no longer subjected to the demanding social calendar of London, had developed a clarity that suggested the previous pallor had been a symptom of something other than mere pale complexion. Her posture, which had curved inward through years of attempting to occupy less space, had gradually straightened as she had learned that her presence did not require justification or apology. One afternoon in March, as they sat in the library taking tea, Margot addressed Eleanor directly. "You have stopped hiding," she observed. "I have watched you during these months, and you have gradually ceased performing invisibility. I was not aware that I was performing anything, Eleanor replied. You were, Margot said. For years you positioned yourself as though you had no right to physical space. You made yourself smaller so that others might feel larger. You anticipated criticism before anyone articulated it, as though preemptive shame might somehow prevent actual judgment. Margot set down her teacup. London society exists because it requires women like you. Women who have internalized the notion that their worth depends entirely upon their capacity to be valuable to someone else. Your value is not contingent upon marriage, Eleanor. This is what you have learned here, and this is precisely why you must now return. Return to London? Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety, or perhaps alarm. You cannot possibly mean— I mean precisely that, Margot interrupted. You will return to London not as a woman seeking refuge, but as a woman who has survived catastrophe and discovered that survival has transformed her. You will return not to secure yourself a husband, but to reclaim your presence in a world that attempted to erase you. Eleanor considered arguing, but she recognized the futility. Margot had not phrased this as a suggestion. Moreover, Eleanor realized with some surprise that she no longer felt the terror that had propelled her departure from London. The humiliation had not disappeared, but it had become contextualized, placed within a larger framework of understanding regarding how society functioned and why it functioned in such manner. Over the subsequent weeks, preparations commenced. Eleanor requested that new clothing be commissioned. Not the blacks or subdued tones that widows wore, but garments in deeper jewel tones that conveyed dignity rather than mourning. Emerald green, deep sapphire, burgundy wine. A dressmaker came from a nearby village and took measurements, creating a wardrobe that acknowledged Eleanor's age not as deficiency but as substance. The clothing itself seemed to alter something in Eleanor's bearing. She moved differently when wearing these colors. She held her head higher. Near the end of Eleanor's 6th month with Margot, a gentleman called at the house. A man perhaps 50 years old with sharp eyes and the manner of someone accustomed to conducting investigations into circumstances other people preferred to remain obscure. He and Margot conferred privately for nearly 2 hours. Eleanor watched from a distance as he departed, and she observed Margot regarding her thoughtfully as the woman returned to the drawing room. That was Mr. Keats, Margot said, answering Eleanor's unasked question. A private investigator of considerable skill. I have known him for many years through connections made during my husband's life. He is someone I trust entirely. Why have you summoned him? Eleanor asked. I have not summoned him regarding your situation, Margot replied. However, he is someone you should know exists. There may come a time when such knowledge proves useful. Margot paused. Trust is a precious commodity, Eleanor. Learn to recognize it. You will need to know the difference between those who wish to possess you and those who genuinely wish to protect you. Within a fortnight, Eleanor found herself again in a carriage traveling toward London. Margot had insisted on accompanying her, at least initially. Eleanor's renewed wardrobe was packed carefully in trunks. Her skin glowed with the health of someone who had spent months engaged in meaningful activity and genuine rest. Her eyes held a clarity that had been absent for years. As they drew closer to London, Eleanor felt the familiar constriction of anxiety beginning. Yet beneath the anxiety lay something else, a resolution that had not existed during her previous life in the city. She understood now that society could only diminish her if she permitted it. She had survived abandonment. She would not permit herself to be destroyed by gossip. The ballroom at Ashford Manor gleamed beneath the light of crystal chandeliers that cast dancing reflections across the polished floor. Though society delighted in drawing lines where none existed, Lady Ashford bore no relation to Julian Ashworth. The similarity in names was an accident of English nomenclature rather than blood. Lady Ashford, the widow of considerable years and formidable temperament, had insisted upon hosting the season's most anticipated gathering, despite the Duke of Northwick's notorious preference for solitude. The assembled guests represented the cream of London society, the titled, the wealthy, the carefully cultivated connections that maintained the delicate hierarchy upon which their world depended. Eleanor stood near the entrance, observing the assembled crowd with the practiced detachment of someone who had learned to inhabit social spaces without claiming them. Her emerald gown drew appreciative glances, though the glances themselves were often followed by dawning recognition that transformed admiration into something more complicated. She was the woman from the scandal, She was the spinster who had been abandoned at the altar. She was that remarkable artifact of social catastrophe, a woman who should have disappeared entirely, but had instead reappeared, transformed by time and circumstance. Margot stood beside her, dressed in deep purple that complemented her silver hair. "You see how they observe us without appearing to observe?" Margot murmured. "This is the precise moment when you must refuse to vanish. Smile. Engage. Remind them that scandal has not consumed you." Eleanor managed a conversation with Lady Pembroke, who seemed torn between genuine curiosity and social disapproval. They discussed the autumn season, the condition of various estates, the marriages and betrothals that had commenced during Eleanor's absence. Eleanor found herself speaking with authority about topics she had previously approached with hesitation. The property management she had undertaken with Margot had transformed abstract knowledge into genuine understanding. She spoke of agricultural yields and tenant improvements with the confidence of someone who had actually engaged with such matters rather than merely heard them discussed. It was while Eleanor stood between conversations, briefly alone, that she became aware of being observed with unusual intensity. A man stood at the far periphery of the ballroom, separated from the general crowd by his deliberate positioning and the subtle distance others maintained from him. He was tall, perhaps 36 years old, with dark hair and features that suggested he had inherited considerable power alongside considerable responsibility. Eleanor recognized him, though she had never been formally introduced. This was Julian Ashworth, Duke of Northwick, the man whose isolation was nearly as legendary as his fortune. What surprised her was that he was watching her, not with the curiosity or pity that others directed toward her, but with something more focused. His dark eyes tracked her movements across the room with an intensity that suggested he was attempting to solve some particular puzzle she represented. Eleanor found herself captured by his gaze for a moment longer than propriety strictly dictated before she looked away, her heart moving with unexpected acceleration. The evening progressed with the customary progression of dances and social exchanges. Eleanor declined several requests to waltz, preferring instead to maintain her distance from the most crowded areas of the ballroom. She was moving toward the French doors that opened onto the terrace when she nearly collided with a solid figure rounding the corner from the opposite direction. "My apologies," Eleanor began, stepping back quickly. "The fault is entirely mine," a deep voice replied. "I was not attending to my surroundings." Eleanor found herself looking directly into the penetrating gaze of the Duke of Northwick. This proximity was unexpected enough that she felt momentarily unable to formulate appropriate response. He was studying her with an intensity that seemed to look past her carefully maintained composure, searching for something beneath the surface. "Miss Eleanor Whitmore," he said, as though confirming the identity to himself. "I do not believe we have been formally introduced, though I have observed you at several functions over the years." "Your Grace," Eleanor replied, managing a curtsy that she hoped conveyed neither excessive deference nor inappropriate familiarity. "This is an unexpected honor." "Is it?" He seemed genuinely curious about her assessment. "One would think the honor should rest primarily with me, encountering someone who has managed to transform their circumstances so thoroughly. The London gossip regarding you has been remarkably consistent in its inaccuracy." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I am not certain what gossip your Grace might be referencing." "The gossip that suggests you are destroyed by abandonment," he replied. "You do not appear destroyed. You appear rather more substantial than you did previously. More real, perhaps, than most of the women assembled here tonight." The compliment was so entirely unexpected that Eleanor found herself momentarily speechless. Most gentlemen either avoided addressing her recent circumstances or approached her with the careful condolence one might extend to someone in mourning. This man seemed to be suggesting that her humiliation had somehow improved her. "Shall we continue this conversation somewhere less crowded?" he asked. "The terrace has considerable advantages in terms of air quality and conversational privacy." Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before accepting. They moved through the French doors into the cooler night air. The terrace overlooked gardens that were beginning their autumn decline, the roses in their final flush of blooming before winter's approach. "The ballroom is unbearable," Julian observed without preamble. "Too many people conducting conversations they have already had dozens of times. Too much pretense regarding matters of supreme insignificance." He paused. You have not asked why I avoid society. I assumed you prefer your own company, Eleanor replied carefully. That is what most people assume, he said. However, the true answer is more complicated. My wife died 7 years ago. Catherine was a woman who found great pleasure in social gatherings, in the variety of human interaction, in the performance of sociability itself. I accompanied her to these events, though I found them tedious. When she passed, slowly, which allowed time for goodbye, I withdrew from society entirely. I told myself it was mourning, but I think perhaps it was something else entirely. It was relief. He turned to face Eleanor fully. Does that seem callous? To feel relief that I was no longer required to participate in something I had never enjoyed? No, Eleanor said honestly. I think perhaps it is human. My own family required my constant participation in their social obligations, and I experienced my withdrawal from society as though I was finally permitted to breathe. Yet you have returned, he observed. I was encouraged to return, Eleanor corrected, by someone who suggested that disappearing entirely would constitute defeat. Julian moved to the stone balustrade that edged the terrace, gazing out toward the darkened gardens. My mother insists that I am wasting my life through deliberate seclusion. She arranged this gathering specifically to irritate me into attendance. She believes that I require a wife, that remarriage would somehow reconnect me to society in meaningful ways. Do you require a wife? Eleanor asked, and then immediately wished she had not asked something so direct. I require many things, he replied. A wife is probably among them, though not for the reasons my mother imagines. I require someone who is genuine, someone who has learned that authenticity is more valuable than the illusion society prefers. Someone, perhaps, who has discovered that humiliation can be transformative rather than merely destructive. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that this man was suggesting something she had not previously considered possible. That survival of catastrophe might be more valuable than its prevention. That resilience might be more attractive than unblemished good fortune. You mentioned observing me at previous functions, Eleanor said, attempting to redirect the conversation toward safer territory. I confess I have paid little attention to the Duke of Northwick, primarily because you were rarely present. My absence was deliberate, Julian said. However, I was present at several functions, standing always at the periphery, watching others navigate the theater of society. I noticed you primarily because you seemed to be engaged in the same observation, watching others rather than participating. It was a shared isolation that made you noticeable. The evening air carried the scent of roses and earth. Eleanor found herself remarkably aware of Julian's proximity, of the particular quality of his attention, of the implications of a duke of his standing engaging so intently with a woman of her circumstances. I should return to the ballroom, Eleanor said eventually. My aunt will be wondering where I have gone. Of course, Julian replied, though his expression suggested he had anticipated this retreat. Miss Eleanor, I find myself hoping that our paths might cross again. The season has become slightly less intolerable now that I know you are present in it. Eleanor returned to the ballroom with her composure fully restored externally, though internally she was far from composed. She had been approached by the most eligible bachelor in England with a directness that suggested genuine interest. The notion was almost absurd in its improbability. 3 days later, Eleanor received a visit from a gentleman who requested a private audience with Margot. Mr. Nathaniel Keats introduced himself as a private investigator of considerable discretion. His consultation with Margot lasted nearly 2 hours. When he departed, Margot offered Eleanor a single sentence of explanation. There are certain inquiries being made regarding Mr. Harrington. The Duke has engaged someone to investigate the circumstances surrounding his departure. Eleanor understood immediately the implications. Julian had not merely engaged in pleasant conversation. He had been conducting preliminary assessment, determining whether Eleanor was trustworthy enough to warrant his attention. And his subsequent action, hiring an investigator to examine Edmund's circumstances, suggested that Julian possessed both the capacity and the motivation to uncover truths that Eleanor herself had never pursued. The following weeks unfolded with a consistency that Eleanor found simultaneously exhilarating and troubling. Julian appeared with deliberate regularity at the social functions where he had previously maintained his distance. He requested dances, though his dancing was conducted with mechanical precision rather than genuine pleasure. He arranged promenades in the park, conversations in drawing rooms, attendance at musical performances. His attention to Eleanor was impossible to ignore, and society took notice with the ravenous intensity that accompanied any deviation from established patterns. The Viscountess, Eleanor's mother, underwent an abrupt transformation in her correspondence with her eldest daughter. Letters that had previously contained barely concealed disapproval now overflowed with calculated encouragement. Eleanor was urged to accept the Duke's invitations, to cultivate his interest, to ensure that she presented herself advantageously. The Viscountess made no pretense of concern for Eleanor's happiness. Her interest was purely strategic. The prospect of having a daughter married to the Duke of Northwick represented an extraordinary social elevation for the Whitmore family. Eleanor found herself navigating treacherous emotional waters. The attention Julian provided was intoxicating in its unexpectedness. No gentleman of his station had ever pursued her with such singularity of purpose, yet she was acutely aware that his interest might evaporate the moment he discovered certain financial realities regarding her family. She rehearsed, in moments of solitude, how she might explain the situation. She never found adequate words. In late November, a letter arrived from her father's solicitor informing Eleanor that the Viscount's financial situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. Creditors had commenced legal proceedings. The family property, already encumbered by numerous mortgages, faced potential seizure within months. The letter was delivered with a physician's report, indicating that Eleanor's father had suffered a severe cardiac episode. Though he had recovered sufficiently to remain conscious and aware of his circumstances, Eleanor read the correspondence with a growing sense of dread. Her father's situation had progressed from difficult to dire. She immediately prepared to depart for Whitmore House, though she dreaded what she might discover upon arrival. The household she had managed so carefully for a decade was apparently collapsing, despite, or perhaps because of, her careful management. When Julian called the following afternoon, as he did with increasing frequency, Eleanor found herself unable to maintain the pleasant composure she had cultivated. She appeared distracted, her responses to his observations perfunctory, her attention clearly engaged elsewhere. "You are unwell," Julian observed, studying her face with the intensity that had become familiar. "Or, perhaps more accurately, you are troubled by something that has nothing to do with my company." "I have received some correspondence that requires my attention," Eleanor replied carefully. "Family matters of some complexity." Julian did not press for details, which somehow made his perceptiveness more acute rather than less. "I had intended to invite you and your aunt to view Northwick," he said. "However, if this is an inopportune moment—" "No," Eleanor said immediately, though she was uncertain why she refused the offered escape. "A visit would be welcome. I believe my aunt would find considerable interest in your estate." 2 days later, Eleanor and Margot traveled to Northwick in Julian's carriage. The estate was vast, encompassing thousands of acres of parkland, forest, and farmland. The house itself was formidable, a structure that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and influence. Yet, as Eleanor observed the neglected gardens, the closed sections of the house, the general sense of a property inhabited by someone who barely acknowledged its existence, she felt a peculiar ache. Julian conducted them through the principal rooms with the manner of someone showing strangers rather than someone genuinely inhabiting the space. The library impressed Eleanor immediately. Thousands of volumes arranged with methodical care, subjects ranging from philosophy to agricultural science to history. She found herself drawn to the collection with an intensity that momentarily displaced her anxiety regarding her family circumstances. "You have read extensively," Eleanor observed, running her fingers along the spines of volumes. "I have read considerably more than extensively," Julian replied. "Reading is among my more developed capabilities. Living is considerably less developed." It was during the tour of the estate grounds that Julian mentioned his brother. They were walking through gardens that had been designed with considerable sophistication, but had been neglected into a state of romantic decay. Overgrown rose bushes sprawled across pathways. Stone benches sat half-concealed beneath vines. "My brother would have understood what to do with this space," Julian said casually, as though remarking on the weather. "He was the adventurous one, always imagining possibilities, undertaking expeditions, engaging with the world as though it held infinite interest. I inherited the title and the responsibility, but he inherited the capacity for genuine engagement. He died exploring territories in northern regions of the world. I remain here, managing property that I can neither fully appreciate nor properly neglect." Eleanor recognized, in his tone, a depth of lament that extended far beyond the death of a sibling. She recognized isolation that had calcified into habit. Yet she also recognized that Julian possessed the capacity for reflection, for honest assessment of his own circumstances. It suggested a man capable of transformation, should he encounter sufficient motivation. "Your gardens could be extraordinary," Eleanor said, abandoning careful neutrality. "Someone with vision could restore them to their intended beauty. Someone who understood both the historical design and the possibility for innovation." Julian turned to regard her. "You envision this transformation clearly." "I have experience managing resources in constrained circumstances," Eleanor replied. "I understand how intention creates outcome." They returned to London late the following afternoon. Eleanor's anxiety regarding her family situation had, if anything, intensified during the visit. She possessed knowledge that these gardens could be transformed, but she also possessed knowledge that her own family's situation was deteriorating with each passing day. The irony was not lost upon her. 3 days after returning from Northwick, Eleanor received a messenger bearing a letter marked with urgent formality. Her father had suffered a second cardiac episode, significantly more severe than the first. She was requested to come to Whitmore House immediately. Eleanor departed for her family's residence within hours. She found her father reduced, physically diminished, yes, but more notably diminished in spirit. The man who had spent decades avoiding confrontation with his financial circumstances was now confronted with them in their most concrete, irreversible form. The Viscount would recover from this episode, the physician assured Eleanor, but his capacity for future exertion had been permanently compromised. Her father died 2 weeks later. Instead, he lingered in a state of diminished consciousness, aware intermittently of his surroundings but largely absent from them. Eleanor's mother maintained a facade of concerned propriety. Her sisters appeared for the funeral services but departed as quickly as social obligation permitted, each absorbed in their own marital concerns. Eleanor remained at Whitmore House for nearly a month, managing the household during what had become the final period of her father's life. She worked with the solicitor to understand the full scope of the financial disaster. The properties were indeed seized. The personal assets were liquidated. The Whitmore name, once respectable, if undistinguished, became synonymous with financial mismanagement and irresponsibility. When Eleanor finally returned to London, it was as a woman whose family circumstances had irrevocably altered. Her father was dead. Her mother was managing the aftermath with the calculating detachment of someone who had already begun positioning herself for reduced circumstances. Her sisters were occupied with their own households and their own concerns. Eleanor was no longer simply the spinster who had been abandoned at the altar. She was now the eldest daughter of a man who had died leaving substantial debts. Her marriageability, which had briefly seemed to improve through Julian's attentions, was now precarious in entirely different ways. When Julian called upon her return to London, Eleanor found herself unable to maintain the performance of casual affection. She was aware that her circumstances had fundamentally altered, and she was uncertain whether his interest could survive this transformation. She attempted to maintain distance, though Julian seemed determined to bridge any gap she created. The question of whether she should inform him of her family's financial situation weighed upon her with considerable urgency. She was uncertain which revelation would prove more damaging: dishonesty regarding her circumstances, or honesty regarding the instability of her position. The drawing room at Margot's residence held the particular quality of intimacy that comes from afternoon light and carefully chosen furnishings. Eleanor sat rigidly upon the settee, aware that the news she was about to receive would alter something fundamental in her understanding of recent events. Julian entered with Mr. Nathaniel Keats, the investigator whom Margot had introduced weeks prior. The man carried a leather portfolio filled with documents, his expression suggesting that the contents were neither encouraging nor simple. "Miss Eleanor," Julian began, settling himself into the chair opposite her, "I have engaged Mr. Keats to investigate certain irregularities surrounding Mr. Harrington's financial circumstances. The investigation has yielded discoveries that are, I am afraid, considerably more troubling than I initially anticipated." Mr. Keats opened the portfolio and withdrew several documents. "Miss Eleanor, your name appears on multiple financial transactions executed by Mr. Harrington during the period preceding your wedding. You did not authorize these transactions, I presume. Eleanor felt the room contract around her. I have never signed any documents related to Mr. Harrington's business affairs. I was not permitted to do so, nor would I have done so. Yet your name appears on contracts, on letters of credit, on agreements regarding property transfers. Mr. Keats continued methodically. Furthermore, the name of your father, Viscount Whitmore, appears on corresponding documents. It is my assessment that Mr. Harrington was conducting fraudulent transactions using the identities of yourself and your father as cover for his activities. Eleanor became aware that she was breathing with difficulty. This is not possible. How could he utilize my name without my knowledge? Forgery is not a complicated matter when conducted by someone with access to your personal correspondence and signature, Mr. Keats replied. Mr. Harrington had extended time in your presence. He would have had opportunity to observe your handwriting, potentially to practice duplicating it. These frauds would have been committed with the expectation that you would not discover them, as you would have been occupied with the obligations of marriage. Julian leaned forward. The investigation further indicates that Harrington required funds beyond what his own finances provided. He was indebted to individuals of questionable reputation. The fraudulent transactions were apparently conducted to accumulate capital, which he then used to satisfy his obligations to these creditors. When his schemes threatened exposure, he departed England rather than face consequences. Why did he abandon the wedding? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer. Because his creditors apparently accelerated their demands, Mr. Keats explained. Harrington found himself unable to proceed with the marriage and also unable to satisfy his financial obligations. Rather than attempt to resolve either situation, he fled. The financial desperation that prompted his frauds also prompted his departure. Eleanor stood and moved to the window, unable to remain seated beneath the weight of this revelation. Her name had been used in criminal enterprise without her knowledge or consent. Her family had been implicated in fraud. What are my legal obligations in this matter? That is somewhat complicated, Mr. Keats replied carefully. You have committed no crime. However, you may be required to testify regarding the fraudulent use of your name, should legal proceedings commence against Mr. Harrington. Additionally, certain creditors who were defrauded may pursue recovery through the estates of those whose names were used. This could devastate what remains of my family's position, Eleanor murmured. It could, Julian acknowledged. Alternatively, the frauds can be properly documented and exposed, which would demonstrate your family's victimization rather than complicity. I am prepared to provide whatever support is necessary to ensure that the true circumstances are understood. Eleanor turned back to face him. Why would you do this? Your involvement in such matters could only diminish your standing. My standing is considerably more resilient than yours is at present, Julian replied. Furthermore, I find myself increasingly invested in your well-being. I have invested in this investigation not from obligation, but from genuine concern regarding your circumstances. After Mr. Keats departed, Eleanor found herself unable to articulate the complexity of her emotions. She was grateful for Julian's intervention, yet terrified of the implications. She was relieved to understand the truth regarding Harrington's departure, yet desperate about the legal consequences she might face. Margot found her in the library, surrounded by documents from her father's estate. Eleanor had been sorting through his papers since returning from Whitmore House, attempting to organize the financial records that had been left in considerable disarray. You have received distressing news, Margot observed, though it was not truly a question. My name has been used in fraudulent transactions, Eleanor replied flatly. My family name has been used. We may face legal consequences despite being victims rather than perpetrators. Then you must cooperate with the investigation, Margot replied firmly. You must assist Julian in exposing the fraud entirely. This is not about defending yourself. It is about demonstrating the truth. I have no wish to appear as though I am pursuing Julian's assistance for my own benefit, Eleanor protested. If I cooperate with his investigation too eagerly, people will assume I am motivated by desire to secure his affection. People will assume whatever gratifies their desire for scandal, Margot responded with characteristic bluntness. Your alternative is to remain silent, which allows the frauds to remain obscure and your complicity to remain questioned. Accept Julian's assistance. It is neither weakness nor calculation. It is practical engagement with circumstances that require resolution. Over the following weeks, Eleanor worked alongside Julian and Mr. Keats to compile documentation of the frauds. She examined her father's financial records, identifying transfers of funds that she had not authorized, signatures that bore her father's mark but lacked his characteristic flourishes. She discovered letters from Harrington to her father, suggesting business opportunities and investment prospects that had apparently never materialized. The investigation revealed that Edmund had returned to London in early winter, accompanied by a young woman of considerable wealth whose father had recently died. The pattern was unmistakable. Harrington was conducting the same scheme with this new bride that he had attempted with Eleanor. The young woman's father's wealth had made her an ideal target for someone requiring capital. "We must inform her," Eleanor insisted when this discovery was revealed. "She must know what her husband intends." Julian and Eleanor traveled to the residence where the young fiancée was staying with her aunt. The aunt was acquainted with Charlotte, Eleanor's sister, a connection that provided access where direct intervention might otherwise have been impossible. The conversation was delicate. Revealing a fiancé's deception before marriage was one matter. Exposing it publicly would still carry scandal. The young woman, whose name was Isabel, received the information with the sort of shock that gradually transforms into fury. When confronted with the documentary evidence of Harrington's scheme, she made the decision to cease her association with him entirely. Her aunt, protective and outraged, contacted solicitors to dissolve the engagement. The scandal that followed was contained but significant. The dissolved engagement, combined with revelation of his fraudulent practices, rendered him entirely disreputable. Creditors moved to prosecute. Connections throughout society distanced themselves from him. The man who had once been considered a respectable widower with moderate fortune became instead a cautionary tale regarding the dangers of financial desperation and moral compromise. Throughout this process, Eleanor found herself gradually relocating her trust from her own instincts toward Julian's judgment. He proved consistently reliable, genuinely concerned with understanding her circumstances rather than merely assisting her toward predetermined outcomes. He treated her discoveries regarding the fraud with respect rather than patronization. He supported her decision to testify, should legal proceedings require it, without suggesting that she should hide her involvement. The exposure of the frauds altered Eleanor's position in society fundamentally. She was no longer a woman destroyed by abandonment. She was a woman who had survived deception and emerged with dignity and tact. Those who had pitied her now regarded her with a form of respect that Eleanor had never previously encountered. The confrontation took place at an estate outside London, a location chosen precisely because its neutrality would prevent either party from claiming advantage through territory. Eleanor sat in the drawing room with Julian, Margot, and the investigator, Mr. Keats. They were awaiting the arrival of Edmund Harrington and his young fiancée, Isabel, whose aunt had been contacted regarding the necessity of this meeting. The documents were arranged before them, evidence of forgery, fraudulent transactions, letters written in Harrington's hand discussing his financial desperation. When Isabel entered, accompanied by her aunt and Edmund, Eleanor was struck immediately by the girl's youth. She could not have been more than 22, her face still retaining the softness of someone who had not yet encountered genuine hardship. Edmund's expression shifted the moment he recognized Eleanor. His carefully maintained composure wavered, then reformed into something approaching defiance. "This meeting is highly irregular," Edmund began, his voice carrying an edge of aggression. "I cannot imagine what business you believe you have convening me in this manner." Mr. Keats responded with methodical precision, presenting the documents one by one. He explained the fraudulent transactions, the forged signatures, the deliberate deception regarding Eleanor and her father's financial involvement. He detailed how Edmund had utilized their identities to conduct criminal enterprise. As each document was presented, Isabel's expression transformed gradually from confusion to comprehension to fury. "These are fabrications," Edmund declared, though his voice had lost its certainty. "Misinterpretations of legitimate business arrangements." "They are forgeries," Mr. Keats corrected. "Deliberate criminal fraud. Furthermore, our investigation indicates that similar frauds have been perpetrated using the identities of Miss Isabel's late father and herself." "The pattern is unmistakable." Isabel stood abruptly. "You forged documents in my father's name? In my name?" Her voice had risen to a pitch that suggested she was only barely containing her fury. "After his death?" when I was vulnerable and grieving. You planned to use me in criminal schemes. Isabel, I can explain. Edmund began, attempting to approach her. Do not touch me, she snapped, stepping away from him. She turned to her aunt. I wish to return to London immediately. I wish to contact solicitors regarding separation. The departure of Isabel and her aunt seemed to collapse whatever remaining facade Edmund had constructed. He stood motionless for a moment, then his expression shifted. What emerged was not contrition, but rather a desperate anger. You have destroyed me, he said, his gaze fixed upon Eleanor. You, with your quiet nobility and your careful performance of victimhood. You have orchestrated this entire situation to make yourself appear blameless. I orchestrated nothing, Eleanor replied calmly. You orchestrated fraud. I merely assisted in exposing it. The legal proceedings that followed were conducted with remarkable discretion, primarily because the Harrington family possessed sufficient influence to ensure that scandal remained contained rather than fully public. Edmund was charged with fraud and forgery. Eleanor was called to testify, a circumstance that drew considerable attention despite the efforts at discretion. She appeared in court dressed conservatively in deep blue silk, her composure absolute. She answered questions regarding the documents bearing her name, her lack of authorization for any transactions, her discovery of the frauds only through the investigator's work. The courtroom had fallen silent during her testimony. When she departed the witness stand, society had witnessed something they had not expected. A woman who had endured humiliation, financial devastation, and criminal betrayal without allowing these circumstances to compromise her dignity. The narrative surrounding Eleanor transformed overnight from victim to survivor, from object of pity to object of respect. Edmund was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment. His assets were seized to satisfy creditors. His name became synonymous with fraud and dishonor. Scandal did emerge, despite efforts to contain it, but the scandal attached itself entirely to him, leaving Eleanor unblemished by association. It was in the library at Northwick, the evening after the verdict was announced, that Julian and Eleanor found themselves alone together. Eleanor had been examining the volumes on agricultural improvement, attempting to distract herself from the emotional turbulence of the preceding weeks. Julian entered quietly and stood beside her, studying the same books. You were extraordinary in the courtroom, he said finally. I suspect you were extraordinary partially because you had nothing left to lose. Humiliation has already visited you. You survived it. That knowledge liberates people. I discovered that appearing dignified while being destroyed was considerably easier than I had anticipated, Eleanor replied. Survival requires only that one continue breathing and moving forward. Dignity is merely the appearance one presents while doing so. Julian moved to the window that overlooked the gardens. Catherine died slowly. For months we knew her death was approaching. I had opportunity to say everything I needed to say. Yet I spent those months avoiding the discussion of remarriage because I felt that entertaining such thoughts would constitute betrayal of her. It was not until after her death that I understood how thoroughly I had wasted those final months through my own cowardice. Eleanor turned from the books to face him. She would not have wished you to remain isolated in grief forever. No, Julian agreed. She would have found my seclusion tedious and my resistance to remarriage incomprehensible. Catherine was a woman who believed in living fully. She would have been appalled to discover that I was conducting my life as though it had ended with hers. He turned from the window to face Eleanor fully. I am aware that your circumstances have been complicated. I am aware that your family's financial situation has created instability. I am aware that you may feel obligated toward me through gratitude for the investigator's assistance. Yet I must state plainly what has become clear to me over these months. I love you. Not because you are convenient, not because you require rescuing, not because your situation creates obligation on your part. I love you because you are real, you are genuine. You have survived catastrophe and emerged transformed rather than destroyed. Eleanor felt something shift within her chest, a recognition perhaps that love could be offered not as rescue but as genuine choice between equals. I have feared, she said slowly, that my feelings toward you were products of gratitude, that I was mistaking rescue for affection. And now, Julian asked, now I recognize that I love you because you have seen me entirely, my humiliation, my fear, my desperation, and you have chosen to remain present. That is not rescue. That is partnership. Julian approached her and took her hand. Eleanor, I am offering you my life, my position, my resources, and my genuine affection. I am asking whether you will consent to marry me. Not as solution to your circumstances, but as choice based on what we have discovered together regarding ourselves and each other. Eleanor considered the weight of this proposal. It represented everything she had once desperately sought, and had long since ceased believing was possible. Yet it was offered not as salvation, but as collaboration between two people who had learned through suffering what genuine connection entailed. Yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you. The wedding was conducted with deliberate discretion in the chapel at Northwick, attended only by immediate family and a select group of intimate connections. Eleanor wore ivory silk rather than white, a subtle acknowledgement that this marriage, though genuine, followed circumstances far removed from the conventional path. Margot stood as her primary witness, while Julian's mother attended with the satisfied expression of a woman whose decades of insistence had finally borne fruit. The ceremony itself was brief, conducted by a clergyman who understood the preference for simplicity over spectacle. Society observed this union with fascination rather than scandal. The narrative had shifted entirely from Eleanor's humiliation to Eleanor's triumph. A woman who had survived abandonment, been implicated in fraud through no fault of her own, and had nevertheless maintained dignity throughout ordeal was marrying the most eligible bachelor in England. The story became one of redemption rather than ruin. Former acquaintances who had avoided Eleanor during her disgrace now competed for opportunities to express their pleasure at her transformation. The Viscountess attended the wedding dressed in dark plum silk, her expression suggesting she was simultaneously delighted by the advantageous match and resentful that Eleanor had secured such fortune through means the Viscountess had not orchestrated. Eleanor had extended the invitation not from obligation but from a determined effort to establish new boundaries. She had made clear to her mother that attendance was welcomed, but that future relationship would depend entirely upon the Viscountess demonstrating respect for Eleanor's autonomy and choices. When the Viscountess attempted to discuss financial arrangements regarding Eleanor's sisters, Eleanor interrupted her with calm firmness. Mother, my sisters are adequately provided for through their marriages. Julian has kindly arranged to clear the remaining debts from Father's estate, not from obligation to you, but from his own generosity toward those I love. However, I will not permit myself to become the source of perpetual financial rescue for family members who previously considered me expendable. The Viscountess had flushed, but she had also acquiesced. Eleanor's newfound authority, grounded in genuine independence rather than mere assertion, proved difficult to challenge. Julian had quietly transferred substantial funds to satisfy the creditors who had been pursuing Eleanor's family. He had accomplished this, not with fanfare, but with the discreet efficiency of a man accustomed to managing large financial matters. Eleanor had discovered this only through the solicitor's confirmation that the debts had been completely resolved. When she had questioned Julian, he had responded with characteristic simplicity. Your family's distress was causing you distress. Therefore, resolving their circumstances resolved a matter of genuine concern to me. Rebecca and Charlotte appeared uncomfortable at the wedding reception, their social positions having been elevated considerably through Eleanor's marriage to the Duke. They were no longer simply the sisters of the spinster who had been abandoned. They were now the sisters of the Duchess of Northwick. The shift in how society treated them was immediately apparent, yet neither seemed entirely certain whether to feel grateful or resentful toward Eleanor for this elevation. Margot remained at Northwick in a suite of rooms that had been specifically prepared for her. She had declined Eleanor's suggestion that she maintain her own residence, insisting instead on a more integrated arrangement. I have lived too long in isolation, Margot had stated simply. I wish to be present in your lives, and I wish for you to be present in mine. Eleanor found herself relieved by this arrangement. Margot's presence provided continuity to her own transformation, a reminder of the months during which Eleanor had learned to value herself. The gardens at Northwick underwent gradual transformation over the following months. Eleanor engaged a landscape architect to develop plans based on the historical design, but incorporating improvements suggested by her own observations. The overgrown roses were carefully pruned and rejuvenated. Pathways were cleared. New plantings were added with attention to color progression through the seasons. Julian observed this process with evident pleasure, watching as Eleanor moved through the gardens with clear vision and decisive purpose. The library became their sanctuary, the space where Eleanor and Julian established patterns of shared contemplation. They read separately, yet together, occasionally sharing passages that had captured their attention. Eleanor discovered that Julian's isolation had been born not from indifference but from profound sensitivity to human connection. He had withdrawn because engagement with others had seemed to compromise his integrity. Involvement with Eleanor had taught him that genuine relationship could actually enhance rather than diminish one's authenticity. One evening, as autumn approached and the gardens began their transition toward winter dormancy, Eleanor and Julian sat together in the library. Eleanor was reviewing architectural plans for a small conservatory that she wished to construct. Julian was reading correspondence regarding the management of various estates. The activities were separate yet coordinated through their shared presence. "I have been contemplating something," Eleanor said, setting aside her papers. "Regarding my future, regarding our future." Julian looked up from his correspondence. "What have you been considering?" "I was wondering whether you might permit me to develop a more formal role in the estate's management," Eleanor replied. "Not merely the restoration of gardens, but actual involvement in the administration of properties, in decisions regarding tenant welfare and agricultural improvements. I possess knowledge that I believe could be genuinely useful." "I believe you possess considerably more than knowledge," Julian replied. "I believe you possess the sort of practical wisdom that most estate managers lack. If you wish to assume such responsibilities, you would be welcomed not merely by me but by the stewards and by the tenants themselves, who have observed your engagement with the land and trust your judgment." Eleanor felt something settle within her, a recognition that she had finally secured a position where her capabilities were not merely tolerated, but genuinely valued. She had survived abandonment, humiliation, financial devastation, and criminal fraud. Yet, perhaps more remarkably, she had discovered that survival itself was not the ultimate measure of transformation. Genuine transformation occurred when one moved beyond mere survival toward active engagement with life and with genuine partnership. As darkness descended beyond the library windows and candlelight illuminated the volumes surrounding them, Eleanor reflected on the distance between the woman who had stood at the altar the previous year and the woman she had become. That earlier, Eleanor had believed marriage to be her only path to legitimate existence. She had accepted Edmund's proposal with resignation rather than enthusiasm. She had possessed no awareness of her own capabilities. Yet catastrophe had paradoxically liberated her. Abandonment had forced her to develop self-reliance. Fraud had exposed her to genuine partnership with someone capable of authentic support. Years of isolation in the countryside with Margot had transformed her from invisible servant to recognized individual, and ultimately, marriage to Julian had become not the conclusion of her transformation, but rather the continuation and culmination of journeys that both had undertaken separately before converging. "Thank you," Eleanor said to Julian, though she did not elaborate on all that gratitude encompassed. "For what specifically?" Julian asked. "For seeing me," Eleanor replied simply. "Not as a solution to your isolation or as an object requiring rescue, but as a person worthy of genuine partnership. For choosing presence over retreat." Julian set aside his correspondence and approached her, taking her hand. "I have learned that true partnership requires courage. Courage to be authentic. Courage to accept another person's authenticity. Courage to build something genuine rather than merely maintaining comfortable illusions." They stood together in the library, surrounded by volumes containing countless human stories of love, loss, redemption, and transformation. Eleanor understood that her own story was not unique. Countless women had survived humiliation, countless people had learned resilience through catastrophe. Yet her particular story, her specific transformation from invisibility to recognition, from dependence to autonomy, from resignation to genuine choice, mattered profoundly because she had lived it. She had survived it. She had been transformed by it. And she had emerged not destroyed but fundamentally altered, capable now of genuine love rather than desperate acceptance.